Hi everybody, in this presentation we are going to tell you a bit more about carbon pricing. This is actually the only way to change our system in the long run in order to correct the global economy so that it pushes carbon-based resources out of it. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep the global temperature rise from this century well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial revolution and to implement measures and actions in order to prevent the temperature increase further to 1.5 degrees. To achieve these goals, more than 100 countries recognized that carbon pricing was one of the most efficient, if not the most efficient tool, to reduce the CO2 emissions. But what is actually carbon pricing and how can it be implemented? The main idea behind putting a price on carbon is to show the people the impact of the emissions of greenhouse gases on their own lives. For example, when people have to pay for healthcare because of the air pollution or because of some natural disaster that happened, these costs can actually be attributed to carbon dioxide emission. Therefore, putting a price on carbon is a way to transfer the costs, which is generated by the climate change, into the cause of climate change itself.
There are actually two different ways of pricing carbon. The first one is the carbon tax, and the second one is known as a cap-and-trade system. We're going to explain the carbon tax in the next slides. The carbon tax is an environmental tax settled by governments in their countries. It gives a price to the carbon dioxide emissions that are generated by fossil fuels. Therefore, when people are willing to fuel their cars, the price they will pay is actually composed of two parts: the cost of the fuel itself and the cost of the CO2 emissions generated by the oil. The principal issue of the carbon tax is that it directly impacts the people's purchasing power, and it is therefore a bit difficult to implement if it's not part of a larger contractionary fiscal policy. When people do not get any other tax relief, such as a reduction in the income tax, for example, they tend to strike, and it can lead to relatively important social protests, such as the Yellow Jacket mass movement, for example. The second way of pricing carbon is known as a cap-and-trade system or emission trading system. It is based on the same model as trading markets, and it operates between companies. The system is giving a right to pollute to the companies that they need to respect. Each company produces a certain amount of CO2. Therefore, in order to reduce the global emissions, the governments decide on a reduced amount of emissions that the companies are allowed to produce for the next year. This amount is known as the cap. In our examples, the factories A and B are allowed to emit a certain amount of CO2 represented by the circles. The factory A decided to change their production process for something more environmental friendly. Therefore, they did not consume all their permits to pollute. On the other hand, the factory B did not make any change in their production system. They outreached their allowed amount of emissions. The factory B needs therefore to buy more permits to pollute to the factory A, which has some for sale. A trading market mastered by the governments is created with all extra permits that the companies did not use. Therefore, the companies such as the factory B can buy the extra allowances they need on the financial market in exchange for money. The emission trading system is also benefiting the governments because they are auctioning the permits and taxing the trade. Let's have a look at the discrepancies between carbon tax and the emission trading system. The first difference between the two options is that the carbon tax directly targets the people and the companies, while the emission trading system is only targeting the companies. What is about the emission reduction? The carbon tax has a slow impact because it is depending on the people's willingness to change their usual carbon-based resources for another option. Let's say, for example, change the diesel car for an electric one, and therefore it can take some time. However, the carbon tax is efficient in the long term. Sweden managed to reduce their CO2 emissions by 26% since 1991. On the other hand, the emission trading system can have a really quick impact, because the opportunity cost for the companies that do not change for a cleaner production process is way more important than it is for individuals. What about the carbon price? In case of the carbon tax, the carbon price is fixed by the government, which gives a lot of certainty about the price itself. The only problem is that it gives also uncertainty about the actual reduction in the emissions amount. On the other hand, the price of carbon on the emission trading system is fluctuating depending on demand and supply. Therefore, it can be really low. In order to maintain a decent price for carbon, governments could implement a floor price so that the companies cannot trade carbon allowances below that price. How easy is it to implement one option or the other? The carbon tax is quite easy to implement. The only problem is the social protests generated by it. Therefore, governments should consider a reduction in the income tax or a compensatory green check in order to implement it successfully in the long run and to avoid protests. On the other hand, the implementation of an emission trading system is easier, but we need to watch out for some points. The amount of allowances the governments give to the companies need to be well assessed so that the emission reduction is efficient, and the floor price needs to be implemented in order to meet the Paris Agreement's goal. The idea with carbon pricing is that in both cases, the government somehow forces the change for other clean resources rather than the usual carbon-based resources, because they are going to become more and more expensive, and therefore people or the companies will try to find an alternative. To conclude, we would like to say that both a carbon tax and an emission trading system are already implemented in France, but we do think that it deserves more attention from the government. Stricter measures need to be taken in order to meet our commitment to the Paris Agreement. This presentation is now over. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to learn more about the subject, we advise you to visit the United Nations Framework website or the Carbon Market Watch website.